Thanks everyone for coming to the webinar today. Hopefully you can hear me clearly. I'm going to tell you a bit about my project on integrating drought physiology into conservation science. Before I get started, I just want to add to Tom's acknowledgement of country and acknowledge the land on which I'm presenting from today, which traditionally belonged to the Gadigal and Wangal peoples of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to Indigenous elders past and present. So a bit of a background to me. I'm currently doing a postdoc at Western Sydney University's Hawkesbury Institute for the Environment, and my postdoc is all part of the ARC Centre of Excellence for Plant Success. So thanks for coming along today. And before that, I did a PhD at the University of New South Wales, and just wanted to put a picture of me being an actual plant physiologist and using lycores in the middle here in a glasshouse experiment. And I was fortunate enough after completing my PhD in 2021 to take a postdoctoral position at the University of Bern in Switzerland. So to get into what I want to talk to you about today, I just want to start off with the preface that conservation does mean plant success. And it doesn't just mean necessarily plant success in nature, although that's a big part of conservation, protecting species, ecosystems, diversity, interactions between plants and their pollinators or consumers or other microorganisms that might help them to survive or depend on them. But conserving native plant species and conserving nature also leads to plant success in that it provides really important resources for humans through ecosystem services, through providing pollinators that help agriculture, and also through things like mitigating climate into the future, as we know that a lot of our forests and even our grasslands too can capture and store carbon and help in protecting our planet in the future. And it's really exciting to see, maybe you've heard whispers of it in the rebid of the centre, there's a big focus on plant conservation and how important that is for plant success. So this is sort of the theme of my research at HIE. And when we look at conservation, there's a global standard for plant conservation, and this is tended to be defined by this IUCN Red List for Threatened Species, and IUCN is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. But what's really interesting about the Red List is that you can pop on to the website and you can have a look at all the different threatened plants that there are by filtering for the plant kingdom. It's about 71,000 species that have been assessed. And then you can also filter for the 3 threat categories. So these are critically endangered, and vulnerable. They're global plants, about 27,000 of them that are threatened around the world. When you dig deep into the threats that are impacting these species, and you look at just climate change, only 3,000, so about 5%, are threatened by climate change, and only 1,100 are threatened by drought, which is such a tiny number, and it's really disparate from what we know about how drought is impacting species in the wild. And this is also trickling down to national standards and how governments assess extinction risks here in Australia as well. So if we take this example, looking at conserving this species of acacia, and we zoom into how climate change is threatening the species, we get this anecdotal evidence where we hear a dry period may result in recruitment failure, and we don't have strong evidence one way or the other if drought is a threat to this plant. But we have a lot of data and knowledge on how drought is impacting plant species. We have knowledge of how drought will look in the future. Climate modelers have been working on creating robust drought projections of how precipitation anomalies and aridity and things like vapor pressure deficit will impact our regions across the globe. We also know some key information on mortality thresholds of particular species. So at what sort of lack of moisture will a particular species with particular traits die or experience, sort of hydraulic failure under what conditions. We also have a lot of information about how plants can physiologically adapt to drought, what traits they might have to adapt to drought conditions. For example, we can look at their xylems and look at P50 values, and we also could look at key traits of their roots. We also know a bit of information on how phylogenetic patterns occur in traits that might relate to drought as well. And I think Ben might be giving some cool research on this in their update coming up. And we also have really good information on demographic knowledge of species. So we have all this fundamental information and knowledge on how plants are responding to drought and might be impacted to drought. But none of this information is getting through into this pipeline and actually going across and going into applied research and helping us to better conserve threatened species. So that's really why we want to come in with this project today. We want to be able to take all of these data and knowledge areas and put them directly into threatened species conservation. So threatened species conservation and any given plant's extinction risk is usually broken down into two categories. How exposed is a given species to drought? So how much will drought change in the future, and what will that plant be exposed to in the regions that it will be growing in? But then also its sensitivity to drought as well. So what's its mortality limits? What are its traits that might confer its adaptation? How will its demography respond to drought? Are there phylogenetic patterns that we can see in all of this? So these two big key areas are what allow us to assess a species extinction risk to things like drought in nature. And so I want to tell you a bit about this exposure part first. And we have been quantifying threatened plant species exposure to future increases in drought in our study. So we just look ahead into the future, look at how drought will change, and then look at ranges of threatened plant species and how much they will be exposed to increases in drought in their range. So we've taken all of the terrestrial plants on the IUCN's red list of threatened species, which is about 65,700 species. We then can get about 10,000 species out of this global data set, which have spatial data available. So this is their extent of occurrence, and it's just drawing a polygon around the sort of accurate known range of that species. We can then get robust drought projections across at least some of these 10,000 species range for 7,600 of these species. So we know for 7,600 species that are on the red list, in their regions where they occur, what drought will look like in the future. And this is quite a robust prediction as well, because it takes into account many different models that predict drought into the future, compares them, and then where areas are robust on the globe, the models agree with one another to some extent. And out of these 7,000 species, I just wanted to show you a bit of a method of what we do. So we take our drought maps into the future. We have a species occurring in a certain region, and we basically simply just map our species spatial information onto our drought projection. And then we're able to assess how much of that species range falls into an area where drought will increase and how much increase will it see. So we're able to do this for around 3,000 threatened species. So that's quite a number of species that don't necessarily have drought written in their threat risk assessment for the IUCN, but we can have a look and see, will they be exposed to more droughts in the future across their range? So here are some of the results that we found so far for our exposure analysis. And this is a bit of a complicated figure, but we'll step through it together, starting sort of with this top portion of the figure. So this bar chart is sort of an overview of all of the species that are threatened and sort of what category they'll fall into. And now you can see a lot of brown in this figure here. And brown is the percentage of species where their entire range will fall into drought increasing regions. And that goes up. So this is a shared socioeconomic pathway, which is basically the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change's sort of projected future. 2 to 4.5 is humans are just going to emit carbon sort of as we are today. We're not going to do too much to curb emissions. But then this is sort of a scary 5 to 8.5 scenario where humans will emit even more carbon than we currently are at a greater rate. And as you can see, drought does, we have more species exposed to drought in this worst scenario. But even under sort of, if we don't do too much for emissions, we're going to see at least 70% of species where their entire range will be in an area where drought will increase in duration, so the length of droughts, and drought will also increase in frequency as well. And as you can see, if we can only look at part of a species range, there's another significant chunk where species have part of their range in drought increasing regions. And sadly, we only get a real small snippet of these blue colors where species in this category will be having their entire range in drought decreasing regions or part of their range as well. So very few threatened species will be in regions where they'll see drought decreases, so shorter droughts or less frequent droughts. So we took all of this sort of data, we put the zeros and ones into the points in these upper and lower limits of the graph, so the brown and the dark blue, went into these dot plots, and then we took these categories of partial just to have a look at, okay, if you're a species that has part of your range in drought decreases or increases, on average, how much of your range is falling into that. So even when we look at these species that may not have all of their range in drought increasing regions, they at least have about half of their range falling into an increase in drought duration. So really these threatened species will see sort of between a half to an entire of their range occur in a region where it's going to see longer and more frequent droughts into the future. So this really shows us that although threatened species don't have drought written into their risk assessments in the IUCN, they will be exposed to longer and more frequent droughts in the future. We then kind of looked at the means of what these droughts will look like. So not just if drought will increase at all, but how much will drought increase. And so I'll just show you the duration changes into the future. And again, I've split these results up into this shared socioeconomic pathway of humans will emit carbon at a rate that we currently do, and then maybe it's going to get even worse with this SSP 5 to 8.5 here. And you can see we have a worse off scenario for our plants under 5 to 8.5. So what we can see here is that on average, threatened species, which are our three categories of vulnerable, endangered, and critically endangered, will see sort of between 1 to 1.5 months, 1 to 1.5 months longer drought under either scenario in the future. So each drought will become 1 to 1.5 months longer in the future. And interestingly, we can see that threatened species do significantly have larger increases in drought duration. So you can see that between these statistical tests, between these categories A and B. What's also interesting is that our non-threatened species, their mean is still above 0. So they're still seeing an increase in drought duration into the future. So all species potentially might be threatened by drought. Our threatened species are just more likely to be threatened by longer droughts. And we see very similar results for mean drought frequency change into the future. So each point, again, is a species mean, and then we take the mean overall of all species in these black lines, and we can see that on average, threatened species will see sort of between one extra event per 30 to 40 years, which is quite a lot. And threatened species will still see an increase in drought frequency, albeit significantly less than threatened species. So these are quite significant numbers. 1 month longer drought and one extra drought every sort of 30 to 40 years, that will have a significant impact on a lot of our species across the globe. But these sort of exposures to drought and what's happening on this broader meteorological scale for our species doesn't actually tell us what is happening exactly on the ground for every population of every threatened species. As I mentioned before, not only do we look at exposure in how species might go extinct to drought, we have to take into account this really important other factor of species extinction risk due to drought, and that's sensitivity. And so we've sort of started off just really digging into this simplistic exposure of species, but the big sort of crux of the project where we're moving next is looking at how can we incorporate both exposure and sensitivity and knowledge of drought sensitivity into extinction risk, because no one has ever done this before. And that's a big reason why drought isn't listed as a key threat to a lot of species in national and international conservation standards. So we really want to create a framework to integrate plant physiological responses and demographic responses to drought so that we can give this framework to scientists, to managers, to policy, to really actually get drought better integrated into conservation science. And the best way that we can do this is to bring together lots of people that know these various different aspects and have training and background in all these different ways that plants can respond and adapt to drought. And this has been done pretty well in fire conservation and fire threat as well. So this is a figure from a national level fire threat framework, and practitioners in Australia are really coming together in the fire conservation theme to have a look at how fire might threaten our native species in the future. So we want to do a similar thing for drought. So we brought together some lovely faces that are experts in various elements of drought, whether that is physiology. You can see the brilliant mathematicians hiding here at UTAS as well, and then conservation scientists and people that understand demography and populations. And we just really want to bring a bunch of different experts together that might have different knowledge and information about drought and pick their brains. And we kicked off our first workshop that was supported by the centre in Tasmania in September. And I luckily got time from all of these wonderful researchers that came and sat down and gave their brain to the project. And this is sort of the explosion of the whiteboard that we ended up with, I think, on even this was just the first day. And we've been synthesizing some of these core ideas and hope to create a nice sort of roadmap paper that takes into account all of the information, knowledge, data, models, all that we have to be able to create a structure that might integrate drought physiological processes into plant conservation. And one really cool tool that came out of the meeting that I just want to highlight is that we use this Otter AI tool where we recorded ourselves in the meeting, and it spat out this incredible summary of everything that we were saying, the next steps we needed to take as a team. And I would highly recommend it if you're doing any sort of big scientific discussions. Otter AI would look into it if you're working collaboratively as a team. It's really cool to try out. And so some of the next steps that we're taking is, as I mentioned, taking all of this information and putting it through this pipeline and working out what is each species' threat from drought, what's their extinction risk to drought, using all of the information that we may have for the species and filling gaps where we don't have information for each species, and really couching all of that in the uncertainty, because conservation always has a level of uncertainty to it, but we need to make decisions. We can't just say we don't know, we are uncertain, so we're just not going to even look into it. We need to make decisions in the face of uncertainty. So, for example, we've kind of hypothesized that potentially you're looking at any given species. Maybe you already know that it might be threatened by drought, maybe you're not so sure. But this species that you know fits into a clade that might look like this in relation to other species, and you've split that clade based on expert information, knowing that this clade itself has particular traits within all of the species in that clade that respond in a particular way to drought. For example, trait 1 increases as drought increases, trait 3 decreases, and trait 2 has a bit of a relationship where it slowly sort of starts as a plateau and then increases with drought as well. So these traits may be respectively adapted to drought, whether it's positively or the inverse of that trait might be adapted to drought. And so then with expert information, not only on what traits are important, so our physiologists have a lot of this information, and some even published data might provide this information for which traits are important in drought adaptation. We can then make a bit of a table for each species and each trait. And so we can pull all this trait data from published literature. We can use resources like TRI database or AusTraits. These are just big databases of measured traits. And of course, there's uncertainty there, but we can have a look and see all these green values are where, yes, we do have information on traits 1, 2, and 3 for each species. But as you can see, there's always going to be gaps. Not every species has every trait measured. And that's where this really cool idea of we can gap fill these traits and use models to have a look at where we have no information on a particular species or no information on particular traits within a species that might confer drought adaptation. We could use gap filling through trait correlations or even phylogenetic imputation as well, and fill these gaps to have a nice framework of, okay, these 3 traits have importance of adaptation to drought within this clade, and we can know them for all species. So back again, looking at our focal species, we can then get, hey, these are the 3 values of traits for this given species. Are they high? Are they low? Where do they fall in this trait drought relationship? And we could even make a bit of an assessment here of, okay, given this species has these traits, irrespective of what environment it's in, it's a real adaptive species to drought. Is it a drought tolerator? Is it a drought avoider? What do we know about it? But we're hoping to even go one step forward from this first sort of stage and look at how this species across all of its populations in relation to its traits might respond to drought in the future. So again, we have this species, we have its known traits from this trait matrix that we might have imputed, and we can look across population 1. So this distribution in blue here is a distribution of all the traits in a given region where population 1 falls that this environment supports. So this environment can support any range of these traits, and this could be you split the trait up individually, or you have sort of a matrix of traits, and the trait falls within the population in population 1, 2, 3, and 4. It might not be right in the middle, it might be at the tail end, but this population can support this species because the traits fit within the distribution of adapted traits to this region based on sort of the moisture requirements or the drought or lack thereof drought that occurs in the region. And so this is sort of in a current snapshot of what our species look like in their current ranges, in their current populations. But of course, as I've said, drought will change into the future. The exposure that species have to drought will change, and it will increase in a lot of regions, as you saw in my previous results. So we might see something like this occur, where the future populations in orange, where the species occurs, will actually shift to a different strategy of traits that in the first graph, our species may survive because it may have this mean trait or multivariate group of traits that will survive under this future conditions and regime. But then in 3 populations, the drought regime will shift the adaptive traits so far that our species actually will fall outside of the tail. And so we could potentially say, hey, this species, because of its multiple populations falling in a really high risk area, is probably really likely to be threatened by drought in the future. We need to take this into account in the way that we assess its extinction risk and the way that we manage it into the future. But that's just a few ideas that we've sort of come up with so far that we're bringing and integrating together in this next stage of our research. And some of the future directions that are a little bit fuzzy at the moment, but that we really need to incorporate in this project are looking at demography as well. So that's really just looking at sort of mean values of populations, but we also need to incorporate that there's age class structures of populations. There's juveniles, there's adults, there's reproductive and non-reproductive species and individuals within populations. So we need to take that account into our models and look at turnover as well. And we really need to define this uncertainty. We might not be able to mathematically pinpoint an exact number of risk, but we want to really categorize threat risk to drought with a level of uncertainty as well around any given species so that we can give managers this answer with, yes, we're certain, we're not so certain, or we're not certain at all. We need more data and more information on a given species. So that's kind of a big broad overview of what we've got going on so far. And I just want to acknowledge all these lovely faces of people that have helped out on the projects as part of the centre, and then a few other names as well that are jumping in from Western Sydney too. So thanks for listening. You can also reach out to me if you have any questions.